Welcome to this explainer. You know the timeline. Between 1804 and 1888, the institution of slavery was legally abolished across the Americas. But, as we're going to see, that decree wasn't the end of the story. It was actually just step one. Today, we're diving into the historical data to unpack why legal milestones didn't magically bring equality and why the echoes of those massive structural changes remain so incredibly relevant today. So here's the core question we're tackling today. What did it really mean to be free, when the actual foundational structures of power didn't budge an inch? Think about it. You wake up on the day of the decree. Legally speaking, the chains are gone. Awesome, right? Well, practically speaking, the land, the capital, and the political power are all sitting exactly where they were yesterday. How does a newly freed population build a life from absolute zero in a world that was literally designed to keep them on the margins?
To break this all down, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the illusion of freedom, move into systems of structural poverty, and then look at laws and social control. After that, we'll hit migrations and cultural resistance, civil and global rights, and finally wrap up with the challenge of the present.
All right, let's jump right into section 1, the illusion of freedom. It's super common to view abolition as this one massive, triumphant finish line. But for millions of people, it was essentially an administrative change that left the deepest inequalities totally untouched. Yeah, gradual decrees passed between 1804 and 1888 granted legal liberation, but the economic reality on the ground was stark. We're talking zero land, zero economic compensation, and zero political rights. Without a single cent of capital or property, newly freed populations were thrown straight into survival mode. They were free on paper, for sure, but economically tethered to the exact same systems that had previously enslaved them.
Which leads us perfectly into Section 2, Systems of Structural Poverty.
So, having lost the legal right to free labor, ruling classes didn't just give up. They actively engineered brand new economic traps to maintain their dominance. We see three distinct systems emerge here. First, in the U.S., you've got sharecropping. Former slaves worked their old master's land for a cut of the crops, but rigged, exploitative accounting kept them trapped in a never-ending cycle of debt. Second, look at Brazil and Argentina. Governments there actively promoted European immigration with the explicit goal of literally whitening the population. This pushed Afro-descendants straight to the margins, relegating them to unskilled labor and urban peripheries, like the favelas. And third, across Hispanic America, we see debt peonage. These were indirect forced labor systems keeping Afro and indigenous families completely tied down in economic servitude. The takeaway here? Poverty wasn't an accident. It was a structurally engineered replacement for slavery.
Let's move on to Section 3, Laws and Social Control.
Now, as you might expect, marginalized groups didn't just accept this reality. They attempted to build schools, start churches, and open businesses. But when economic traps weren't enough to stop that progress, systemic, legislative, and often violent reactions kicked in. Looking at the data, the methods varied by region, but the end goal was identical. In the U.S., control was maintained through Jim Crow laws, using legal segregation and the terror of lynchings. In Brazil, it was the branqueamento or whitening policy, which enforced institutional marginalization without even needing explicit segregation laws. And down in the Caribbean and Latin America, control took the form of social whitening and a deeply veiled yet highly effective systemic racism. To really grasp the severity of these mechanisms, let's zoom in on the U.S. for a second. Jim Crow laws weren't just terrible social customs. They were actual state and local statutes that legitimized racial segregation under this completely false doctrine of separate but equal. According to the historical records, these laws effectively sabotaged the progress of the Reconstruction era. And they weren't just enforced by the police or judges. They were backed by the systematic, organized violence of white supremacist organizations. The law and pure terror worked hand in hand to ensure newly freed people remained structurally subdued.
Now for a pivot. Section 4, Migrations and Cultural Resistance.
Here's the incredible thing about human resilience. It's an incredibly powerful force. Fleeing those rural economic traps and all that relentless oppression, millions of Afro-descendants packed up and migrated to massive urban centers. We're talking about the Great Migration to cities like Chicago and New York, plus massive urban expansions in Rio de Janeiro, Bahia, Cali, and Cartagena. These huge migrations radically transformed Western culture. People arrived in these big cities with basically nothing but their heritage. And in those densely packed neighborhoods where they were forced to live, a profound cultural alchemy began to take place. And out of that alchemy, we got the foundational pillars of modern global music: jazz, blues, samba, son, reggae, and eventually hip-hop.
It is absolutely fascinating to realize that these massive global phenomenons were actually born as forms of cultural resistance in some of the most marginalized, under-resourced neighborhoods in the Americas. Against literally all odds, these communities birthed art forms that would go on to conquer the globe.
So, to summarize the huge impact of this era, music, dance, and literature literally became weapons for the preservation of memory and dignity. Art functioned as this highly organized form of survival. Think about it. When you're denied a voice in the courts, and you're denied a voice at the ballot box, what do? You put your voice into a trumpet, you put it into a drumbeat or a poem. This cultural resistance laid the groundwork for everything that was to follow.
Which brings us to Section 5, Civil and Global Rights.
All that cultural resilience we just explored became the direct fuel for organized political movements demanding global rights. The struggle shifted from just surviving to systemic dismantling. Check out this timeline. In the 1920s, Pan-Africanism takes root, with leaders like Marcus Garvey pushing for black pride and diaspora unity. Jump to the 1950s and 60s in the US. The civil rights struggle uses marches and boycotts to finally push through the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts. Then in the 70s and 80s, we see this massive push for visibility in Latin America, with movements in Brazil, Colombia, Peru, and Cuba demanding formal constitutional recognition. And that brings us right up to the 2020s, where global racial justice protests have reignited discussions on systemic racism. When you view it chronologically like this, you realize it's all a single ongoing global effort.
And that brings us to our final section, the challenge of the present.
Because history isn't just a closed book that we simply put back on the shelf, right? The work of abolition is still viewed by many as a very unfinished process. Today, we're looking at ongoing, open debates around equal opportunities, the really complex question of historical reparations, and the active eradication of structural racism. Whether you're analyzing university admissions, wealth gaps, or political representation, the data clearly shows that the systemic echoes of the post-abolition era are still actively being negotiated in our modern societies.
I want to leave you with this really powerful thought drawn straight from the historical documentation. True freedom is not just the absence of chains. It is the full presence of social justice and respect for human dignity. Abolition definitely removed the chains, but building actual, true freedom is a much longer, much more complex project. So as you look at the world around you today, ask yourself, how much of our society is still working to bridge that gap between the mere absence of chains and the full presence of dignity? Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the structures around you.